So welcome all to the Nature Agenda. This is a webinar series brought to you by Natcap. And our Christmas gift to you all today is a riveting discussion on measuring nature in your supply chain. So we've got an hour together. We're joined by a distinguished panel. We'll spend the first 45 minutes in discussion with the panel and then have plenty of time for questions at the end. So please make sure to keep your questions coming. The better the questions, the better the discussion. If we move swiftly on to introduction, so I'm Sebastian Leap, I'm the CEO here at Natcap, and we're a nature intelligence company who help measure, act, and report the interactions that business have with nature. So we're particularly focused on thinking about the impacts businesses have, those dependencies, and how they translate into risks and opportunities for direct operations, but also increasingly in supply chains, which is why we're so keen to have this discussion today. We work with big companies around the world, but also with our consulting partners, and very pleased to be joined by Matt from ERM today. On the panel, we have three folks who I think I can call giants of the nature and supply chain space. We have first and foremostly David, who leads sustainability at Reckitt. Reckitt are the home health and hygiene company who make a lot of the brands that you probably have lying around your house or office today. We're talking Strepsils, Nurofen, Dettol, and Durex condoms, which are going to be important for our discussion later. David's been in the past at Waitrose, Co-op, Croft, Cadbury, so brings a real wealth of experience to the nature and supply chain question. So thank you for joining us, David. Delighted to have you on board. We're also joined by Matt. Matt Haddon spearheads ERM's Biodiversity, Nature and Water consulting practice. Matt's joining us from the US, so we're particularly grateful for him making this ungodly hour work. So thank you, Matt. And Matt has been working on nature for some time, and as you can imagine in the consulting space, working across geographies and across sectors. So we'll bring that nice wide perspective to bear today. And then we have Beccy, our very own Chief Science Officer. So Beccy leads our science team here at Natcap, sets the science strategy, helps build and oversee the development of all our models. By background, Beccy's a quantitative ecologist with 10 years of experience building natural capital models and has a PhD in forest ecology from the University of Cambridge. So that's our panel. Before we get started in the discussion, I suggest we do our usual tradition of having a survey to just figure out who you are on the line so that we can make this discussion as useful as possible for you. So a poll has just popped up on your screen. Please fill it out, and we'll give you a few seconds to do so before we go to the results. We've had some very strong performances from sustainability recently, so let's see if they can maintain their lead or if procurement and supply chain will do a bit better today given the topic. So nail-biting stuff as we wait for the results to come in. We'll give it another few seconds. And then should we move to the results? Jane, let's see who we have on the line. Okay, wow. So this really is a sustainability group. So we have 70% of the line 70% of folks online work directly in sustainability teams at big companies. We have a few folks from academia, NGOs, and service providers, and a small number from marketing and sales. So this really is a sustainability discussion, which makes complete sense. Alrighty, so let's get into things. So measuring nature in your supply chain, I mean, for most companies, the greatest nature-related risks, opportunities lie in their supply chain. That's intuitive because that's where the raw materials that drive your business are usually coming from, and that's where the greatest risks and opportunities you'd expect to lie. The issue, of course, is supply chain data is hard to come by, and for nature in particular, understanding the location of assets and operations is important to provide a really accurate picture. So you couple that with a world of scarce budgets, and you have a cocktail of challenges that makes really measuring nature in your supply chain quite challenging. But this group has done it many times before for a bunch of different companies. So let's dive straight into things. And David, maybe let's start with you, just to get our definitions straight. How would you describe and interpret what we mean when we say measuring nature in your supply chains? What does that definition mean to you?
Oftentimes I think we get polarized views that this is about trees. And it's, for me, it's much broader than that. It's about the whole of the natural resource, the natural assets that we are dependent upon, both directly and indirectly. Um, and I think it's important also to identify where you are in that value chain. Are you an asset owner? Do you own the farms, the mines? Or are you an asset off-taker and an ecosystem service beneficiary in a range of ways? Now, that could be because, as is the case of Reckitt, we don't own farms, but we're buying latex from rubber farmers in southern Thailand. And we'll talk about the detail of that later. We buy a lot of natural raw materials. We buy a lot of ingredients that are made from minerals. Most of all, our biggest single ingredient is water. All of those things fall into how we have to consider nature and its impact and our dependencies on it around the world in the global value chains that we're part of. And the key thing is, as you just said, Seb, understanding what and especially where those things are coming from, and the interdependencies that you then face in sourcing them to support a global value chain and trying to understand the risks at the base of that value chain where nature is the overarching agenda to consider.
I think you're right, David. I think when some people hear nature, they think immediately biodiversity. Biodiversity is a theme that's important within it, but it's not. It's not an exhaustive. It's not an exhaustive definition of the term. Becky, so if that's how we're defining nature and supply chains, what's the case for measuring that now for businesses? How are you hearing sustainability teams make the case for action internally?
Yeah. I mean, I have to agree with David as well. You know, when we talk about nature, we're talking about systems rather than isolated components. And I think you nailed it, Seb. Why is that important for companies? Well, for many companies, their biggest impact is going to be in their supply chain. And so if you're looking at TNFD reporting or looking at material under CSRD, ignoring your supply chain and just looking at impacts and dependencies in your direct operations is not going to fly. It's really not going to pass muster. We talked about dependencies, risks as well. So, if you have large exposure to risks in your supply chain, that really should be showing up on your risk register. And we'll get into that in a little bit, I think, about how we determine those risks. But that would be the primary cause, I think, is that for many companies, their interaction with nature is not just in their direct operations, and it's often the majority is in their supply chain.
You mentioned CSRD there. Regulation, a big driver of action here. Matt, do you want to give us a bit of an overview as to how you're seeing regulation start to drive action here? What are the regulations? What are they saying?
Yeah, sure. I think probably a lot of people on this line are familiar with the range of the acronyms that are bouncing around. Whether that's Becky mentioned a couple, CSRD, TNFD, EUDR, of course, the deforestation regs, anti-slavery. The water directives. There's a whole bunch of different things bouncing around, particularly in Europe, but now spreading out around the world. And I think that's setting the agenda for a lot of people. Starting to create awareness. I think there's a couple of really notable things that we haven't really seen yet. One is we haven't seen what does the enforcement phase look like for a lot of these regulations. So we don't know how people are going to respond to what companies are putting into the public domain. And as a result, I think what we've seen is a lot of early work on companies trying to understand the scope of these regulations, the impact in terms of their reporting. And what we're starting to see among the leaders, but by no means widely, is starting to think about the business risks, the real world, the real meaning of the word dependency, which I think is the really interesting one in the context of supply chain.
So I see there's been a bit of uncertainty on those acronyms the last couple of weeks. We've seen CSRD be resubmitted to Parliament for debate. I saw this morning, more certain news on EUDR, which looks like it's going to go through again, relatively unchanged. Have you got any early signs from your clients into how they're reacting to that uncertainty?
I think they continue to continue to work away at the early stages of things. I haven't seen companies started to say, "Oh, we're not going to bother." If that's what you're looking for, we haven't seen that level of reaction yet. We're seeing the tentacles of things like CSRD spread out around the world. So we're doing work with clients in the States, in Asia, all over the world, who are either directly affected or they're being asked questions because they're in somebody's supply chain. So we haven't seen anybody really start to pull back yet. I think it's partly because it's dawning on people, to go back to David's point, just how dependent their value chains are on the natural world. And I think that, as a sustainability person from college forward, and for the last 25, 30 years, at certain points it amazes me that businesses haven't really thought about how they depend on the natural world, whether that's for raw materials or water or whatever. But I can see that waves of that crashing across the corporate world, as people really wake up to what does that mean for my business, and also as the finance world wakes up. And I think a thing to not forget in the context of all those transparency regulations is the theory of change that sits behind them, which is the one that we kind of got used to in the context of TCFD around carbon and climate. And it was this very simple thing about transparency that says markets can work well if there's a good flow of transparent information between investors and companies. And TCFD was very simply, investors, you don't know enough about the climate risks associated with any business. So we'll make a requirement that means you have to be transparent. And so that whole theory of change is what all these other regulations are following. And so I think there's going to be a huge amount of learning for companies, and then also for investors and customers, who then say, I have a concern about that. What are you doing about ABCD? And we just haven't seen that play through yet.
David, on that point, very curious to know, does that theory of change manifest itself at Reckitt? Does that pressure kind of materialize in the way that Matt described, or does it look different?
Yes, both yes and no. Let me explain what I mean, Seb. The regulations are there and they're coming, and there are certain parts of that, like EUDR particularly, which create an immediate, obvious issue to tackle. CSRD will do the same, even though implementation for us is a little bit further down the line. What is coming more clear, though, I think, is the recognition that when you consider how nature impacts your balance sheet, it creates a discussion about how resilient that value chain and your business and your opportunities are. So it stops being a conversation about compliance. It becomes a conversation about resilience and therefore opportunity, relative opportunity. TNFD, to build on Matt's point, will further drive transparency around nature-related financial risk for investors in exactly the same way we've seen on TCFD. The expectation that you have a transition plan on carbon is now baked in for most European, if not most global companies. That same position is coming through TNFD. The acceleration of nature through TNFD into the corporate agenda towards that corporate balance sheet conversation is, I think, actually much faster than we saw with TCFD. And so I just expect this to become more and more visible. Our biggest investors are already asking me, and have asked me for probably the last 18 months at the very least, what are we doing to think about key natural asset dependencies in certain parts of the world? And actually, once you frame it that way, then you get to a discussion about, okay, so if that's your dependency, what's your risk? What's your mitigation plan? What's your transition plan to drive that mitigation? And that leads you to a very different, and I think in my case, in my perspective, a lot more positive outcome in terms of how nature gets looked at within the business. It is very fair, sadly, to say nature wasn't on most people's balance sheets. It is no longer going to be the case that can continue. And the more dependent you are, the more visible that transition plan will become. And then that drives you into a conversation about metrics and interventions and understanding what the state of nature is. Your dependency will drive those choices that organizations make. In the old adage of what gets measured gets done, measuring and understanding the ecosystem that you're part of, your dependency on it, and then the impact that your interventions have will become a critical part of any business conversation. And for me, that's way more important and much more motivational inside an organization than the threat of regulation, or not just the threat, the position of regulation. Driving opportunity, creating resilience that gives you confidence in business direction for the next 5-10 years of your business strategy is hugely important, inside and to other stakeholders of the business. I'll give you an example. We were thinking in Reckitt about a new factory in India. The very first question on the paper was, will there be water in this location in 25 years' time? Water's our biggest single ingredient. It might have been the best location for logistics. It might have given us tax breaks from the local town. It might have been great from a workforce perspective. But if you cannot guarantee your biggest single ingredient is going to be there and available, there's no point in building that factory there. All those other benefits are non-existent. That's how I think things are starting to change as we become much more understanding of those dependencies that we all have, and that we then create businesses where nature is on the balance sheet and is managed in the same way we manage other business dependencies.
No, that makes a lot of sense, David. I'm particularly struck when we spoke a few weeks back at how engaged you said a few of your investors were on this topic, asking very specific questions, willing to invest resources to follow up, which I think is, to Matt's point, a bit of the direction this is all heading once better data is available. No, that makes a lot of sense. Matt, did I interrupt you?
I was just going to jump on David's excellent point about water and dependency on water and the thinking of it as a long-term position, because I think it's the real what that started to do with organizations is have them really think about, what do I need today? What do I need tomorrow? Who else is using this resource? And water is a great example, because you've got the climate change question and availability and all that kind of stuff. You've got population change. And then you've got the whole question of what other players are there in a watershed. And we were talking earlier about the location specificity of nature compared to many other things. You're stuck in a watershed. If you're going to be in watershed A, then you are in watershed A. And moving water around is a fool's errand. It's an incredibly expensive thing to do. So a bit like you're thinking, David, we've been doing projects for a couple of years now with some big tech firms, and the exam question, interestingly you framed it that way, is very similar. Is there going to be water there to cool my data center today? Yes. And in 10-20 years time, will I have a riot on my hands if I take it?
Yeah,
because I might have a license, but do I want a bullseye on my back when the local community runs out of water? And so it forces companies to think really strategically.
I think that's a great point, Matt, if I can just jump in on this again, Seb, sorry. Because in the past, oftentimes I think organizations often existed and believed they could continue and thrive in splendid isolation. In the case of nature, that will not be practical. To Matt's point, it's no good if Reckitt, in some of the projects that we're doing, is replenishing more water than we take out for abstraction purposes. That's great on one hand, but it's no good if somebody else then puts another factory in just down the road that takes twice the amount, or if the population of that town grows by 25%. In order to understand those interdependencies, we have to work more collectively and understand collective solutions. And the good news is some of those are coming and becoming increasingly effective. I mean, I've been looking and working on things like the Nairobi water basin work for probably the last 15 years or so in various guises. It's a great example of public, private, and civil society collaboration to understand the pressures on that water catchment area going forward and to collectively manage it, which is probably one of the reasons why Nairobi is now growing as it is, because there is confidence in the infrastructure that's there. You also have to think about it in terms of perhaps new ways of creating value as well. It's not just the provision of, for example, more water or sustainable water resources. It can also be the prevention of nature-related risks, for example, downstream flood risk management. Oftentimes we think more only about the input. We can think about the output and how we reduce impact in other ways that is to our benefit. And things like nature-related flood management that make a catchment area beneficial in more ways than just what comes out of it as an extract is very important, because that brings in a whole new set of asset creation and things like how you manage downstream floods reduces your insurance cost, means your business continuity is there, but done in a way that adds value upstream, literally, in terms of land management, maybe even carbon capture through new ways of land management. So this is a new set of value opportunities. And I think the people who are able to recognize, adapt, and connect them are in a great competitive position, not just to be more resilient, but to have advantage in the future.
Beccy, can I bring you in here? Because you've done a lot of thinking from a methodological, technical perspective, how to measure impacts, dependencies, risk, and supply chain. Maybe sticking with this water theme or beyond, do you want to speak to a bit the results of that work and how you're thinking about things?
Yeah, and I actually wanted to pick up on a sort of thread that David and Matt were pulling on there about scale as well, because I think it's really important that we consider the right scale at which we're assessing these impacts or risks associated with nature. So one is a temporal scale. So, David, you mentioned there the need to look into the long term. And I agree with that. We could evaluate these risks over 5 years and completely miss a potential risk to an asset that might only materialize in 10 or 15 years for water, for example, Seb, to your point. And the other is the interdependency of some of these global supply chains. So if we assess the risk to a company for a particular commodity in their supply chain, it might be that you decide it's immaterial to your business because it's a very fungible commodity. So you think, okay, well, I don't have a risk for this particular commodity because I could simply buy the same commodity elsewhere. But if there is a systemic risk to that entire supply chain, you might be exposed to price shocks or an inability to change to the same commodity from elsewhere. So the scale of assessment is really important here, both for the resilience of supply chains in their whole for a particular commodity, the temporal scale into the future and when these risks might materialize, and then, of course, you say interdependencies within the system or within your business. So I don't know if that answers your question, Seb, but that was certainly a thought that I was having.
Really, that triggered a thought for me. So, David, I heard you stir things up at the, I think it was the Royal Society a month ago, advocating that the nature-related risks in your supply chain were less material than you had thought or others might expect. Do you want to speak a bit to how you've thought about materiality and how you reached that conclusion?
Yes, and I think this also comes back to my earlier point, Seb, about are you an asset owner or are you an asset off-taker? And when you apply a dual materiality lens, as we are doing through CSRD, there are two trigger inputs. One is the financial, one is the impact. And what we're seeing is as a potential customer for multiple input value chains, individually, they are not necessarily going to be financial and material. That doesn't mean to say, however, that you can opt out of them, because you could switch to a different value chain for the material you're reliant upon. That will still have risks. You could switch to a completely different material. That will change the nature of those risks. But none of those options are completely risk-free. And so the choice that you make is what's the most resilient blend that you create and act to support both what is happening on the ground, which you're inherently dependent upon, and how your business or organization then operates as an off-taker from it. That's very different, however, if you're the landowner, if you're the farmer. Then the nature-related risk is significant to you and direct to you. And I was talking earlier this morning about things like, increases of pests that are decimating olive oil crops, olive trees in Southern Europe. If you're an olive oil farmer in Southern Europe and because of biodiversity impacts and climate change associated that's driving those things, then you potentially stand to lose all of your livelihood. So the question there is, what can you do to mitigate that? Can you start to think about different types of biological defense mechanisms? Do you need to think about different tree varieties? Do you need to diversify out of olive oil? Well, that's a big call because that's probably has been in the family for generations. For those people, for those asset owners, it's a slightly different and much more visible material conversation. They don't have the flexibility that people at the next step in the value chain have. But I'll say it again, the people in my position in the value chain do not have an excuse not to get engaged. The question is how you blend, because not engaging is not going to create resilient value chains for you. And so it's trying to work through how do you blend things effectively to support and build longevity into those natural assets that are part of your balance sheet.
What would you say to the counter example if we, sorry, Matt, go ahead.
Right. Well, I was going to say you've got some amazing concentration risks in some commodities as well. I mean, I remember driving up through southern Spain 2 years ago and being stunned how it took us like 300 kilometers to go through the olive belt. And then so we were in the car and the kids were Googling how many olives are grown in southern Spain. And it was something like 60% of the world's table olives and oil come from that whole area of southeastern Spain. And so now we have this massive concentration risk, not just for the farmers, but for the value chain. And we've seen it in other commodities, like all the stuff that's been going on with cacao, where 60-70% of the world's cacao comes from West Africa. And that's been suffering from very difficult weather conditions. Same sort of things coming up with coffee futures. So we've created some arch efficiencies in some value chains that mean we have concentration risk. And David's absolutely right. Both suppliers, the people with the land, and buyers have really got to start thinking about that.
One of the saddest moments of my life over the last few years was walking in southeast Italy for miles and miles through fields of burnt and chopped down olive groves, which had been completely ruined by an invasive species. And I forget the name, but they were trying to fight it by preemptively cutting down these groves that have been around for hundreds of years. So, the olive situation in Europe is really quite serious. But would there be a counterexample then, David, to your point, which is if you think you are relying on a commodity that is quite liquid and fungible, so, if Malaysia fails, you can source it from elsewhere. Are we not actually exposed? Are those crops actually not more connected than we might think on a global level? So a crop that fails in Malaysia is actually quite likely to fail elsewhere, and so the liquidity of that market is maybe over-egged.
Maybe not, because I mean, different. Look, one of the critical things to remember is that nature is a very local. Nature's impacts are local. And the necessary conditions for failure don't necessarily apply elsewhere. And at the same time, nature is also adapting. But you can't. I mean, I'm certain Beccy will have a comment on adaptation within nature itself in terms of how this frames. There are you can consider different origins. Those different origins for the time being, at the very least, are still there. But as we approach planetary boundaries in a number of areas, the frequency of those options being available is unfortunately going to change. And also how we look at land use is going to change. Are we using land and indeed water on that land to grow something that is for food or for non-food use? And the questions are going to increasingly put pressure on land use. It will also mean land gets used in different ways. It won't probably be enough to use land to grow crops just for the seed. You need to find, through bioengineering and biochemistry, ways to unlock value from the stalk of that plant as well as from the seed of that plant. Because the way we've approached agriculture in the past will not be as effective or as practical, indeed, as the area of land that is available and the amount of water that is available to use in agriculture. In parallel, you can also develop alternative materials that may be dependent on something completely different, which is less at risk. And whilst I'm not, I don't usually advocate only technophilic solutions, because I think you have to have a much more ecologically balanced perspective on how those solutions come through. There is no doubt that there will be new materials and the ability to make new materials, make products from different materials that helps answer some of these questions. And if not, changes the dynamic of rubber farming in Malaysia, to go back to your example, Seb, allows that land to be used for other things in different ways. And there are examples of that coming through all the time that we are seeing. But ultimately, there is a dependency that goes back to a natural assets for most things. And until we start to be more aware of that and invest in the resilience of that, then the risks will only grow as planetary boundaries become more and more apparent to us.
We're talking about nature here at quite a lot of different levels, and I think we're really emphasizing the importance of that locality. But of course, information on the precise location of assets is hard to come by in supply chain. So Beccy, you've been doing a lot of thinking about this. What's the right level at which to measure nature and supply chains in a world where data is very much imperfect?
Yeah, because I agree. I was going to emphasize the same point, that I think for people on the line who work in sustainability but perhaps have a background in climate, we can't sort of overemphasize this point enough, which is the difference. One of the key differences with the rest of nature versus the specific example of climate is that it is very location specific. So what that means is the ability to see through your supply chain to the location of sourcing of a particular commodity or a processing plant or a factory to make the components that you're buying is really key and is time well spent, because it allows you to understand the magnitude of the impact or indeed dependency on nature and what you could do about it. The way that we've been thinking about this, so the guidance from frameworks like SBTN, for example, is to take a commodity first approach. So they have a list of high impact commodities. If you have those commodities in your supply chain, that's where you should start. And the reason behind that is because for many of those commodities, although they have impacts on nature through their processing, through their transport, through their creation into other products, the majority of that impact is in the production of that commodity. Now, that's not true in all cases, but as a general rule of thumb, that's the guidance, and it's probably a good one. So that's also where we start as well. But I think for any company first getting into this space, and I'd love to hear, David and Matt, what you think about this as well. That's our sort of guidance is think about those commodities that are likely to have the largest impact, largest dependencies. Start with those. Spend time getting visibility in your supply chain such that you can locate them in the most accurate way possible. And this is going to be a journey for everybody. So if you can get it down to country, fantastic. If you can get it down to region, even better. And then start to get down to your suppliers. And the longer your supply chain, the harder that's going to be. But if it's a nice short supply chain, for a lot of companies, that's going to be possible. And I think what the really interesting part then comes in to, David, what you were alluding to, that conversation between off-taker and owner, asset owner. Because I think a bad outcome from a lot of this work and a lot of these frameworks is that companies start to just disinvest or start, moving their supply chains to a shorter supply chain, better visibility, somewhere that has lower risks. And those landowners who have been providing those commodities for many years then find that they're struggling or they're out of business. the impacts on nature may then still continue. So it's much better to engage in your supply chain, engage with those producers that you can find in your supply chain, and work with them to try and reduce the impacts rather than simply shifting around. Ultimately, the outcome for nature isn't, we're not going to get where we want to get to.
I think you make a great point, Beccy, there about how that approach can mitigate adversely towards some of those asset owners. And I would go further and say it's almost certainly going to put smallholder farming more at risk. That has a number of knock-on effects, none of which are good. Because many commodity supply chains are dependent on that smallholder base. And even for something as apparently simple, and I pick my words very badly when I say apparently simple. I'm going to use the example of EUDR, and all of you who are listening will tell me it's not that simple. I get that. But as a piece of legislation, it appears simple. That has an adverse effect on smallholders because they are, by necessity, harder to certify against some of these things because of the complexity of the smallholder value chain. The same is true if you think about cocoa, as Matt was talking about earlier. And those smallholders are absolutely integral to the effectiveness of those value chains. And yet, if they are excluded from the market in the way Beccy was describing, or because they're harder to certify, then they are still going to be looking for ways that they have a livelihood to support their families. And they are closer to the poverty line than many of us can ever imagine. And the natural thing that smallholder palm oil farmers will do, is to chop down more forest to increase their income to survive, which, as Beccy says, is entirely contrary to what we would hope would be the case from EU deforestation regulation. These are things that if you start to think about how you build a more resilient supply chain and how you engage it, you can find creative solutions. So one of the things we're doing with the smallholder rubber farmers is now starting to think through, having supported their organization to a cooperative, to allow us to introduce stronger agronomy that improves their productivity and therefore livelihood, that improves the quality, that benefits me. The next step is to think how, with them, we can add an ecosystem service payment to strengthen biodiversity on and around the farm, that strengthens the resilience of that farm, and potentially within that, because we're prioritizing carbon-related insetting opportunities, pay them also for carbon value. That then adds a lot more value. So perversely, while some of this may mitigate against those smallholders, there is an opportunity similarly for them to actually strengthen livelihoods and be a really integral and essential part of a much more resilient value chain, and adding new value points in terms of mitigated nature-related risk and carbon opportunity for the long term that benefits me as the off-taker from that value chain. Seeing it in that way joins up the conversation in a very different way from a very commoditized based supply chain. And I see a decommoditization approach starting to come through where landowners, especially smallholders, are taking and finding opportunities in added value. And it helps me to help them create those value opportunities because that strengthens my value chain in ways that I'm then talking about carbon transition plans or nature-related risk to investors and so on and so forth, as well as strengthening the supply of a core natural raw material.
When some folks on the line, David, hear you speak about paying ecosystem services to smallholders, I'm sure they're thinking, wow, that sounds great, but that sounds expensive. Can you say a bit about how you've thought about the costs of those interventions and made the business case internally?
Yes. I mean, it's really pretty simple. Once you've identified that you have a nature-related financial risk, as TNFD's framework starts to get you to do, and which the investors are probably starting to think about and asking you already if they haven't already started doing so, then it begs the question, if that's my nature-related risk, what is my intervention to reduce it? And what is the value of that intervention in the sense of, is it proportional to the level of risk? That then instructs you effectively on what that payment to that farmer needs to be. Because if it's insignificant, then it doesn't mitigate the risk and it doesn't stack up for your investors. At the same time, you don't want to overpay from it. sometimes inside the business, I think I try and describe this in the ways, if you're trying to insure your house, let's say your house is worth £100,000. Gosh, chance will be a fine thing in the UK today. Let's say 500,000 is a much more average number. If you're insuring it for rebuild, but you're only insuring it at a rebuild cost of 250,000, then you're not going to get your house back if it burns down. At the same time, you don't want to insure it for £1 million worth of rebuild value, because then your insurance premiums are too high. Think about how you rely on natural assets in the same way. At the very least, you want to ensure that if something goes wrong, or more importantly, your interventions are building resilience, you're investing in a way to a level that is proportionate to the dependency and therefore the financial risk that you face if that supply chain fails. And that then starts to help create an understanding of the level of ecosystem service intervention and therefore payment that you might want to think about making. Does that help answer the question, Seb?
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. And Becky, maybe turning to you, because we spoke recently about another interesting lens on that same problem that David mentioned, which is, can you build a business case around increased quality of a commodity? So do you want to speak a bit about when you've seen that come up and whether that's something that's worth considering?
Yeah, I mean, so this won't be an issue for all companies, so it's important to consider your own specific product or supply chain. But something that we have seen come up before for some companies is that the quality of a commodity is just as important or more important than the quantity of it. And I think a lot of solutions out there and the kind of early views on supply chains are looking purely at quantity. So can you get enough of, to David's point, palm oil, for example, to meet your requirement to produce your products that you sell to customers? In some cases, if you are a food and drink manufacturer, if you are a supermarket, quality is actually a more important indicator. And there, when you're looking at risks in supply chains, it's not just whether there's a flood that means that a particular crop fails, but are you getting the right mix of carbohydrates in a grain in order to produce the product, the premium product that you're making? And there, I think the modeling isn't as well advanced, and I think the data aren't as good. That's something that we've done a little bit of thinking about, but would certainly be a sort of direction of travel for this kind of assessment. And another good example, probably where we are underestimating risks currently, as our data and analysis is still quite new.
And I see a few good questions coming through, so I want to make time to get to those. But one last big theme that we haven't touched on yet, Matt, which we discussed previously, was the integration of climate and nature. So I know that there is increasing recognition. The two issues obviously are interconnected. From a company perspective, there's a real desire to simplify the sustainability story rather than complicate it. How are you seeing these two agendas start to come together?
I think what we're seeing in a way is two or three things going on. One is what has become increasingly robust and ubiquitous, which is the climate transition plan. In reality, they'd actually become decarbonization transition plans. If you look at a lot of what companies are doing, it's about the decarb journey. It's not actually about climate. And because if we look at climate, it's really about nature and water and biodiversity and all the downstream impact of a changing climate. So what we're starting to see is companies recognize that there's a lot more to a climate transition plan than just decarbonization. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we're seeing quite a lot of clients. I was talking to a bank, in fact, when we were all together in Cali for the biodiversity COP, about the question he asked me was, how can I use my climate transition planning machinery, which is now moving, and how can I create a Trojan horse for nature and water? So he was basically saying, how can I tuck in these other issues in a way that rides the momentum that exists inside my organization? So we're starting to see that happen more and more. And I think that's pushing things back into a much more strategic view of climate transition. And I think that's one of the big themes here, is the difference between tactics and strategy. Tactics for me are get the compliance done for CSRD and just put a report out. strategy is, how does this affect my business across the whole of the value chain? And I was thinking about a point that David made earlier. It's the difference between management and governance. I think a lot of companies are going through the management steps at the moment, which is how do I cope with these things today? How do I make this commodity more resilient? How do I move from this supplier to another supplier? The bigger question that we're starting to see companies really think about, and this will be what investors are interested in ultimately, is what's your governance process so that you can keep doing that? So actually you're directing your company to be more resilient in the context of a changing climate, increasing fragility in certain value chains, changes in water availability around your manufacturing operations, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think we're starting to see that frame emerge, and I expect it to emerge with full force in the next wave of all these different implementations around, whether it's CSRD, whether it's EUDR, but that's the direction of travel, I think.
I just came off a call before this with a food and beverage company where we were helping do a nature risk assessment in their supply chain, and the final words of the CSO were, and next year we're going to look to integrate this with our climate risk.
Yeah.
So I think you're right. This is where 2025 is taking us. Beccy, you've done a lot of thinking on this as well. Was there anything you'd add on that theme?
Well, just that, I mean, I agree. I think it's interesting, Matt, that that person used the phrase Trojan horse, because I think what we are hearing, and I know a lot of the people on the line will be feeling this very strongly, is that, budgets are tight, they're getting tighter. If you've got sign off for climate already, do you think you can get that to stretch to nature as well? Or actually, are you looking to simplify your set of providers and set of data sets into just one single report, one single strategy, rather than, something for climate and something for nature and maybe something for something else and EUDR separately again? I think that's a good thing, a very good thing, because as we said at the beginning, nature is a system. It doesn't exist in these isolated blocks of climate and then nature and then something else. And actually the solutions make much more sense, to David's point, when you think about climate and nature solutions integrated into one. You get better outcomes, they're more optimal, they're often cheaper as well. So I do think that's the direction of travel. I think where we are at the moment between TNFD and TCFD and other frameworks as well is that they do slot together nicely. It does make sense to do these things as a whole. I think it's going to be a journey for a lot of companies. And I think the obvious place to start is around your risk assessment. So for many companies, if you've already been looking at climate physical risk, a lot of that translates to nature, to natural assets, to supply chain. So if you're already looking at flood risk and extreme heat and wildfires and so on, then they're as much a risk to natural assets and your supply chain as they are to your built assets that you probably considered already. So that's a good place to start. But yeah, I do think that, I agree that that's a direction of travel. It's certainly something that we would like to see as well. I think it makes much more sense for nature.
I'll go further, Beccy, even. I think it is essential that we join up not just nature and carbon solutions, but also take into account the socioeconomic element of that solution to really cement solutions. As I was trying to say earlier, if there isn't a socioeconomic value for the landowner, then longevity in that carbon conversation, in that nature conversation, in that risk mitigation and transition plan and resilience building conversation, from my perspective, in my part of the value chain, will not be there. And while in the past, and maybe inherently, we like to design a solution for the one problem that's in front of us and then solve for the problem after that, and so on and so forth, I'd argue that has meant we've solved for carbon. And now we're trying to solve for nature. And within that, beyond that, we'll have to solve for the socioeconomic impact around it all. I don't think that's constructive. I'm not going to suggest that it will reduce the cost by, down to, instead of 1 + 1 + 1 = 3, it won't just equal 1, but it will be cheaper and but more importantly, be more impactful and have longevity if you do it connected that way. That's why when I look at our carbon plans, my preference is to keep them as tight to our value chain and think about insetting rather than offsetting, and drive further investment into local value chains that give me a nature and a carbon, and also therefore a socioeconomic, social impact value in those solutions. And I would encourage everybody to do that. I hate to say it, I think we've commoditized carbon to solve for a problem. And I think that has been at the detriment of nature, particularly in the consideration of how value chains work. I don't think that's going to stop, but I think the more we can create conjoined solutions of carbon, nature, and social impact, the stronger those solutions will be. Now, I also know that that makes them slightly more complex. But for me, this is where sustainability teams are very good at understanding the interdependencies and the complexities. And if anybody can make this happen as part of a business strategy, then sustainability teams can do. But it becomes a conversation about business strategy, as Matt said, almost at the outset of this conversation, as it is a conversation about planetary and natural resilience as well.
And I think I just jump into, I think this is hopefully it's music to your ears, Seb, but I think I really mean this. This is where high quality data becomes so important, because otherwise it's just opinions. It's the opinion of I mean, we're seeing it in double materiality. Companies that will say, "Oh, I don't think that's important." You say, "On what basis?" "I just don't think it's important." You go, "Oh, wonderful. Okay, so what's your data set that says that that's true, or how have you considered it?" And you don't have to. DMA doesn't really force you to do that, because that's the way it's framed. And I think when you start to cascade that out across an organization, if you go to somebody running a supply chain and you say, "You need to do different," you go, "Why?" They'll say, "Why?" You need data that demonstrates why something would be better. They'd be better off by making some different choices. And I think that question of starting to experiment with available data, geographic location specific data, and things that are then translated into things that others in an organization can understand, that's the opportunity, that's the playground in front of us at the moment. Because if we don't do that, you can't move beyond the opinion.
I agree. And also breadth of data as well. Because of course, Matt, if we're looking at nature-based solutions for climate, I could find a data set that would tell you that eucalyptus plantations or Sitka spruce would be optimal. And it is optimal for carbon. But you really need to consider water and water tables, and you need to consider biodiversity and all the other factors that David mentioned, and the social side. And that breadth of data then allows you to optimize across nature as a whole, if you like, rather than one measure of it.
Right.
I do want to give time to the questions. There have been a few good ones. David, you've done a heroic job of answering in real time, so it looks like we're on top of them. But one question just came in. How do you recommend measuring nature for quality data? Which I'm interpreting as being, how do we differentiate between higher and lower quality data in the nature space? So Beccy, maybe to you on that question, how do you think about what quality means in the nature data perspective?
Yeah, we spend a lot of time thinking about this. So I think it's important to understand the question that you're trying to answer. So there will always be a case for more precise data, more accurate data in terms of spatial precision or precision of a particular measurement. The question is, what does good enough look like for you now and in the future? And there, I think what's really important is, data that will give you an accurate answer. And by accurate, what I mean is that it is correct, at least in a broad sense. So we know both the directionality and the broad magnitude of a particular, say, impact or dependency. And then I think what good data looks like depends a little on the question that you're asking, but high quality providers is important. Making sure that it reflects the latest science, making sure that it gives you a level of precision to distinguish between one option and another that you might decide between. And that it enables you to answer the so what. And that's where I think data providers themselves can be helpful to help you understand what does a high number or low number look like. And then, that is a lot what our team does, is to filter out the data sets on a particular topic to understand what is the best quality data here, and then how to interpret it. So going from, I guess, data to insight. What does the so what? What should I do with this? And how bad is it in reality?
Very useful. And I think we only have 3 minutes left. So that doesn't give us much time for another big question. I might just read out my favorite question here from an anonymous attendee. Will this webinar recording be shared? This has been really insightful, and I'd love to share this throughout my sustainability team. So I hope that's a sentiment that's shared by others on the line. It's been wonderful being with you for the last hour. We've got our next webinar coming up at the end of Jan. We've got Marco Lambertini from the Nature Positive Initiative. We've got Annie, who leads Nature at Tetra Pak, and others. So please do look out for that at the end of January. But otherwise, it just leaves me to thank Beccy, David, Matt. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. Thank you to all of you for joining, and have a wonderful Christmas break when it comes.